Hi, I'm Adrienne LaFrance, the Atlantic's executive editor. Welcome to The Big Story. Today, we're going to talk about democracy, threats to democracy in America and around the world. I'm joined by my colleagues and our staff writers, Barton Gellman and Anne Applebaum. Thank you both so much for being with us. And let's jump right in. I'm going to start, Bart, with you. You wrote our latest cover story. The cover line is January 6th was practice, and it's a remarkable story, a remarkably alarming story. And I wanted to hear a little bit about what you went in expecting to find and what surprised you the most along the way over the course of your reporting. If you could start there.
I went in looking for more of the story behind January 6th, what led up to it, and what it led to, sort of situated along a continuum. And what I found, the story has basically three main strands. One is that January 6th was the culmination, but really only one small part of a long and systematic campaign to overturn the election. That it had a specific role in that, which was to buy time, and that it came fairly close to succeeding in that sense. The second strand is that January 6th is probably the debut of a mass political movement that for the first time in 100 years in this country is prepared to use violence as a tool. That there are tens of millions of Americans right now who are passionate, conspiratorial-minded, and believe that the use of violence is justified to restore Donald Trump to the White House. And the third is that there is an ongoing conspiracy, really, an ongoing operation in which Republican operatives are looking through all the places which were obstacles to Donald Trump's attempt to overthrow the last election, and is going through and uprooting those obstacles. So it is paving the way for another coup attempt in 2024.
So I want to go back in a moment to this question about sort of the threshold for violence in this country. It's an important and scary one. But you mentioned 2024. Are you feeling more worried about 2022 and 2024 than you were about 2020? I'm sure many of those who joined us today read your previous cover story, which was about how Trump might subvert the election or try to, and you were largely proved right in that piece. So I'm curious, like, after that story, your level of worry versus where you are now.
Yeah, I'm kind of the bad news correspondent. So I was very worried about Trump's capacity to create chaos and undermine the peaceful transfer of power in the 2020 election. And I wrote in advance about how he might do that. Right now, I think he intends to do the same thing again in 2024. I think his prospects of succeeding are a little bit better. I think conditions are more favorable to his efforts to undermine the election because he's had practice. He's faced no serious consequences. And as I said, there are thousands of political operatives and lawyers around the country who are doing their best to pave the way for it next time and figuring out where his effort went wrong and trying to fix that.
And same question for you. How worried are you today, like almost a year after January 6th, and sort of watching and processing the aftermath versus before the events of that day?
So I am continually surprised by what's happening inside the Republican Party, even though I have myself written about it and analyzed it and tried to explain it. I've written about the phenomenon of complicity, of why people go along with things they know to be wrong, which is not it's not unique to the United States or unique to world history. In fact, it's very common. And I'm still surprised by the extent to which both the Republican Party is seeking to whitewash the history of January the 6th so that, the perpetrators are heroes and the victims are villains. I am surprised by the extent to which they are building on this mythology. I mean, again, this is something that has lots of precedents in the past. The election was stolen, and therefore we deserve to break the rules in order to win the next one. And by the way, I do think it could be 2022 as well as 2024. And that, you can look at the 1930s. The myth of something stolen from us that gives us the right to cheat is something we've seen in autocratic regimes in the past. And for me, I mean, Bart's story is really important because it lays out the path which is being followed. The use of these low-level electoral positions in the states, the way in which the Republican Party is trying to put sort of proponents of the big lie into positions where they'll be able to manipulate election results. The work that's being done inside state legislatures to convince them to change election results. And so he's very good at that. What worries me more is the mood of the party and the mood of the country, and the degree to which, as I say, the past has been whitewashed. The present is being seen through a filter that's dishonest, and the number of people who are going along with that. And that false vision of history is the piece of the story that's most dangerous, because as you said, these aren't people who, as you both said, these aren't people who think they're breaking the law or bending the electoral rules, although they are. They've been convinced that they're the true patriots and that they're acting in the interests of America. And that's, I think, the most frightening piece of it, because changing that is actually harder than changing the institutions.
Well, and without a proper reckoning on complicity, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot with regard to sort of the details that have only begun to emerge in terms of members of Congress and their role in, either planning or participating in January 6th. And so I'm curious, like, without a proper reckoning on complicity, we won't have real accountability. What to you, Anne, do you think accountability should look like? Like, what should we as citizens be demanding of government and leaders in terms of reckoning with January 6th and all of those who played a role?
I mean, the January 6th Commission needs to not just tell the story; it needs to make a combination of the January 6th Commission and the Attorney General need to begin to charge people, and not just the people who showed up on the grounds of the Capitol on January the 6th, but also the planners, the members of Congress who were part of the plot. We need this to be, we need a legal resolution of this, and we need it quickly. We need it before the next election, and not 10 years from now. There is some hesitancy, and I understand it, on part of many Democrats and others who don't like the idea that we now live in a country where, one party puts the other party in jail or seeks to, maybe that does have echoes of failing democracies. On the other hand, we are beginning to be a failing democracy, and I think unless accountability is and by the way, that includes accountability for Trump on multiple grounds. But unless there is some legal consequence for breaking the law and for being part of this conspiracy, then I think we are going to see it repeated.
Bart, I'm curious for your observations on the congressional piece of this. I know Representative Gosar was someone who comes up in your latest story, and there are a number of others who seem to be sort of the poster members of Congress for not taking this seriously, and in some cases for deliberately misleading the public about what happened. As you were going through your reporting for this piece, which figures struck you as most dangerous?
Well, you could divide the leaders of today's Republican Party into two or three groups. You have, I suppose it's possible that there are a small number of true believers in the notion that the presidential election was stolen and that Biden is illegitimate, that even under truth serum, they would allege that the whole vote was rigged. A vastly larger number subjected to the same truth serum would acknowledge that Joe Biden won. But many of them opportunistically are continuing to propound the mythology on this subject, and they're using that because it whips up this passionate base, and they're competing to sort of out Trump on those things. I would think that close to a majority, certainly a very large number of Republicans know perfectly well that the election was a normal and appropriate election, and they're afraid of the Trump base. They're afraid of Trump. They're afraid of the base. Sometimes literally afraid for their safety. If they were to stand up and say Trump's a charlatan, Trump is not telling the truth. If they were to do what Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger have done, at minimum, they would be drummed out of the mainstream of the party the way those two politicians have been. But many of them are actually frightened about violence.
And when you look at the conditions present in the US now, I mean, I know a moment ago you alluded to the 30s and other eras in other countries. What strikes you most in terms of looking elsewhere in place and time where democracy has eroded or failed? And given that, and given the conditions here now, what do you think we as a country and as citizens should be paying more attention to?
So, I mean, the United States is very much part of an international trend. It's funny, I'm speaking to you from Poland, and for the last couple of weeks, a couple of days even, I've been on television programs here talking about Polish democracy. And it's a little bit like in the US, everybody wants to find the source of the problem in Polish history or in some mistakes made by particular politicians or so on. And I keep telling them what you don't realize is that almost exactly the same thing is happening in the United States. And of course, the same is true vice versa, that these kind of conspiratorial movements that seek to undermine democracy, that are based on imaginary theories about, sometimes about, elite betrayal, sometimes also about elections, that this is now common in almost every democracy, actually. And the question usually is just what proportion of the population believes it. So I don't know, in Germany, it's 20%, in Poland, it's 50%, in the United States, I don't know, Bart would have to guess what percentage it is. So it is part of an international trend. And so although of course there are local domestic American reasons for what's happening, also look at the transformation of social life, economic life, and in particular the information space by the internet, the way in which that has facilitated the creation of polarization and deep divisions, and the ease with which lies can be told and repeated and reinforced, which was not as easy before in the old-fashioned media that some of us grew up with, 10 or 20 years ago. You have to look at the global situation and the way in which people have become afraid of the complications of the world, the fear of the outside, this looming combination of sort of immigration slash foreign competition slash confusing politics from other countries. The United States is very much subject to those kinds of fears, just like other countries are. And the third thing I would point to is the role and function of international kleptocracy, the way in which some of our business elites have been enriched by their dealings with autocratic powers, and the way in which they have come to emulate and admire those powers. And of course, Exhibit A here is Trump, whose career was very much boosted by, maybe even mostly created by, his dealings with Russia, with Kazakhstan, with the post-Soviet world, and he clearly came to emulate that world and admire it. And you can see him bringing tactics, from the autocratic world into the United States. So you can see in that sense the influence of autocracy inside America, because the appeal of those tactics, whether it's disinformation, whether it's dark money, whether it's surveillance tools, all of that is coming, some of that is coming from abroad. Of course, some of it is also homegrown. But as I said, the United States is part of an international trend. It's not different. Some of us are disappointed to learn that it's not different. We hoped it would be different, but sadly, it's not.
Well, you had a great, speaking of kleptocracy, one of your recent pieces was on this very topic, and I would urge our those who are here with us today to read it. It's an excellent piece. On the subject of social media, I mean, the social web and this chaotic informational environment we're in poses huge problems, but there's also, I've been wanting to ask you about this actually, Anne. Anyway, there's this really interesting tension where aspects of the social web that one would think and hope would be good for democracy. For instance, people being able to post anonymously and protect their identities, maybe in places where the government would crack down on them for speaking out otherwise, or even just the power to self-publish. I mean, it's miraculous and should be great and should help boost democracy, but then we're seeing all of the sort of flip side of that and the spread of disinformation and misinformation and media manipulation and all the rest. And so I wonder how you think about sort of where we are. And Bart, for you too, I know this is a subject that you know very well. Where does that leave us in terms of how the social web is and operates today and its relationship with democracy and the possibility for democracy to be sustained? And what are your current thoughts? Like, do we need to reinvent the internet, or is it just some mild tweaks? Like, where do you stand now on that?
I mean, I think the problem with the internet is that the rules of conversation, and by the way, there are always rules of conversation in every context, whether they're unspoken rules like in a television studio or whether they're explicit rules like in a parliament. There have always been, a conversation is always structured, who gets to speak for how long and so on. And the problem is that in the modern internet, the rules set by the social media platforms, which includes YouTube, Google, as well as Facebook. Facebook is easiest to pick on, but in fact, it's true of all of them. The rules are created to benefit the companies, and the companies benefit from as many customers as possible staying online as long as possible. And as it turns out, the material that keeps people online is anger, aggression, emotion, and stories and posts and articles that divide people. And until we have a way to change those rules, by which I do not mean censorship, I mean either through creating alternative forms of social media where the rules are different, where they resemble more the rules of a town hall or the rules of a civilized conversation, or we find some way to moderate and regulate algorithms so that they promote, civilized conversation instead of aggression, and that is possible. Since they do the opposite now, then they could do something quite different. Until we find a way to do that, I think we're going to go on having this problem. I mean, I don't think it's the only explanation for the current circumstances, but it's a really important piece of it. Even people who aren't online are shaped by online conversation in ways that they don't know. Just because journalists are shaped by it, politicians are shaped by it, other voters are shaped by it. It's one of the fundamental things shaping the nature of our public debate. And it really is frightening what is being promoted and what spreads the most quickly online.
Art, I'm curious for your take on this, in particular, given your concern about the possibility of violence and the fact that we know that online violence very easily bleeds into offline violence.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would endorse everything Anne just said. The problems with social media are that as soon as you show any interest in one side, you are swiftly placed into a bubble in which you hear only that side. So there's nothing that would extend the context for you or show you a different point of view. You are immediately within a world that does nothing but reinforce what you already thought. And second of all, in order to keep people's focus in exactly the way that Anne was describing, you're moved toward an ever more extreme version inside that bubble. And so you click on something and next thing you're offered is 10% more radical and then 10% more radical after that. And soon you find yourself in a violent and conspiratorial world. It's always been true that there were disappointed partisans of one side in a presidential race who thought the thing had been fixed, it was unfair, we was robbed. Social media has amplified that considerably. But the one other factor that's essential to explain what's happened in these past few years, what's essential to explain how it could possibly be that 2/3 of all Republicans in the United States believe the election was stolen, is that they were told that by the leaders of their party, by Trump above all, but by the whole Republican elite. They were either told that or there was conspicuous silence. No one doubted it. No one said, "Hey, wait a minute, fair's fair. We lost this time. We'll go on to the next one." When you are given permission by elites to believe something, it has a way of ratifying that belief. And we're in a terrible situation now in which a super majority of one of our two major parties believes a complete fiction about the world and is prepared to act on that.
Well, and you're calling to mind something else that came through really strongly in your recent piece, Bart, which was that you're not just saying, I mean, talk about the sort of, yes, there's always been partisans, of course, and sure, the social web makes partisans more extreme and extremists ever more extreme than that. But this idea that the cause of democracy itself has become a partisan issue, which is tremendously concerning. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about that, especially just sort of watching the rhetoric move among these Republican Party leaders who are endorsing the fiction, like you said. Sort of, you've seen in real time how they've sort of stepped back from democratic principles and sort of this erosion that seems to be accelerating.
Well, there are a couple of things to say here. One is you have to understand that the portrait of the world that's being painted by mainstream Republicans is so extreme that it leads to radicalization. So if you have Republicans telling their constituents that the election was stolen, that the interloper in the White House is a tyrant, that he's a communist, that he's literally trying to destroy the country, which is common language in use by members of Congress and of the House and the Senate and governors and candidates, and you're giving yourself permission to take pretty strong measures in response. And a series of polls at the University of Chicago found that there is a substantial chunk of people in this country who believe both of two propositions. One, that Biden is illegitimate, and two, that violence is justified to restore Trump to power. We have not had tens of millions of people in this country believe that for something like 100 years. What happened on January 6th was an example of political violence. Historically, in recent decades, political violence has been conducted by young men in their 20s and 30s, unemployed, poorly educated. And that is not at all the picture of the violent perpetrators on January 6th. They are middle-aged. Their mean age is 42. They're well-educated. They're white-collar. They're well-employed. And we haven't had that kind of middle-class violence in this country since the rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s.
And what, in your view, Bart, does it take to reverse, or at least hopefully soften this sort of sense that there's justification for violence among this cohort?
Well, I mean, you would have to have a party leadership that was prepared to accept the results of an election. You would have to have the messengers who speak most passionately to this group and its beliefs, telling them that they'd get their turn next time. We're very far from that place in American politics. I don't see what could bring us there.
So I have approximately 1 million more questions for you both, but we also have at least that many from those who've joined us today. So I will go to some audience questions. We have many variations of this same question, but I'll start with this one for you, Anne, which is, what should concerned citizens do besides read Anne Applebaum's essays and be filled with helpless existential dread?
So I get that question a lot. And actually, it's not really my intention to make everybody feel helpless. It was funny, after Bart's piece last year, the one before the election, in which he predicted some of what happened on January the 6th, I wrote a piece that ran in the Atlantic about what you can do if you're worried about the election. And really, the advice from that piece, which was from, October, November of last year, holds, which is, in our current time, it's not enough to just vote. And it's not enough to just read the news, although, I'm sure everybody on this call does that. Join something. Join your local branch of the Democratic Party, join the Republican Party, and try and work on that from within. Sign up to give money to follow, to be part of the conversations from groups like Protect Democracy. And there are several others. We can maybe post those later. There are several other groups that have formed to carry out lawsuits, to inform people, to push legislation. Join those groups, pay attention to them, donate to them. Run for office yourself. There was a very good New York Times article. It was yesterday or the day before, which described how fanatical believers in the big lie are now in the Republican Party are now contesting elections, often at very low levels, jobs to be local treasurer, to be local, electoral counter. Some of these jobs have responsibility for elections and for counting results. Contest some of those jobs or help someone do it. What we need, more than anything else, is some grassroots response to what is clearly a grassroots movement on the other side. I would also say, talk to people that you know. So talk to your family members and coworkers who are believers in the big lie, and try and get through to them. It's not always impossible. I've had some luck sometimes talking to people who disagree with me, by trying to present things in a different way, or by appealing to some authorities, sometimes even by quoting Liz Cheney or one of the other Republicans who still live in sort of the reality-based world. But think of yourself as an actor who can do something. Don't give in to nihilism and don't give in to despair. Think what it is you can do in your local community. How can you donate? How can you volunteer? How can you be part of some group, which is trying to push back? And that's what I would begin with at the most basic level. I mean, of course, there's other different advice. Maybe Bart wants to go into that about what legislation Congress should pass and what Biden should do. But at the most basic level, I think, this is the time to think of yourself not just as a worker, and not just as a consumer, or not just as a member of your family, but also as a citizen. And I think there are things that citizens can do.
That's great, thanks. And I do want to go to Bart, actually, and to sort of preface this additionally, one of the points you make in your piece is that President Biden isn't doing enough and should be doing more to counter sort of anti-democratic threats to the country. I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that, in addition to anything you want to add to what Anne just said.
I think President Biden is doing substantially nothing to address the democratic emergency that I believe we're living through right now. I think that he is surrounded by people who believe that the most important thing he could do to support democracy is to show that democracy can deliver. And so he is doing big, bold policy ideas on infrastructure and social spending. He's working to take steps to address climate change. He's got to address COVID. Presidents always have lots on their plates, but none of those address the fact that there is a steady march towards taking control of the election apparatus on the part of Republicans of bad faith, who believe or pretend to believe that the last election was stolen and that they have a right to put their thumb on the scale when it comes to counting the next election. And so I can't tell the president what to do because he knows better than I do what it looks like when a president says, as he has said at one major speech, that we're facing the greatest threat to democracy since the Civil War. You need action commensurate with that, and he needs to put his weight behind several congressional bills that would take steps in the right direction towards voting rights and free vote counting. But I want to reinforce something Anne said, which is what people can do individually. I think Americans who support democracy and who want our system to continue the way it has been under constitutional rules need to wake up to the problem and show some passion about it. That we're in a peculiar situation right now in which Trump supporters believe by large margins that our democracy is under threat, and they believe that falsely for false reasons. And fewer than 1/3 of Democrats are worried about this subject right now. And so there's this weird disparity. And what Anne said about running for something, one of the biggest threats is that Republicans in thousands of small jurisdictions at the township level even are running for election supervisor on the platform that the last election was stolen. And they may be true believers in that. And once you have a true believer that the election was stolen last time, as I said before, you have given yourself permission to steal the next one.
One of the things I wonder about is the extent to which people don't worry about this because they allow themselves to stay sort of like stuck in the abstract of what it all means. And I wonder, Bart, maybe I'll start with you, but I'd love to hear what Anne thinks too. What does life look like after a stolen election, an actually stolen election in America? Like, sort of paint a picture for us of what that would mean for people. What freedoms are we taking for granted? Whatever we're taking for granted, sort of what changes in our country if we cross that threshold?
Right, but the most basic freedom we have in this country, and the foundation for all other freedoms, is that the people are sovereign and that the people get to choose their leaders. And if someone steals that from them, it's a catastrophe. You have someone wielding power over the most powerful government in the world illegitimately and without the consent of the governed. Anyone willing to steal an election like that is going to be willing to bring to bear other tools of repression that you see around the world. And this is what Anne can speak to much more clearly than I can. But I think you would have to worry about freedom of political expression and dissent. You'd have to worry about corruption of government agencies towards keeping that government in power. You'd have to worry about the breakdown of guardrails. Trump liked to joke in his not joking way during his first term about how he was going to have a third and a fourth term. And the inhibition against that would be at risk if you had a stolen election.
Well, and our colleague George Packer has written recently in our last issue about sort of the failure of imagination among Americans who aren't worried enough. And same question for you about sort of what's the worst case scenario as you can envision it? Like, what should Americans actually allow themselves to imagine about what's possible if we don't reverse course here?
So there are a couple of frightening scenarios, but yes, one of them is that we have in effect a stolen election where Trump becomes president, not because he won the right number of votes in the Electoral College, but because the Electoral College was manipulated by people who were put there to manipulate it. That's my worries are actually on both sides of the political spectrum, because if we have an illegitimate president, then we have the specter of violence from both sides of the political spectrum. I can imagine parts of, I don't even want to call it the left, but in parts of the center being outraged by the new president and by what's just happened. I can imagine violent protests of a kind we haven't seen in many years. I can then imagine Trump, pulling one of the tricks he pulled in Portland last summer and bringing in some form of uniformed police or indeed the military to put down those protests. I mean, I can imagine a kind of violence and a kind of dissatisfaction with government. Again, that I can't think of a precedent except the Civil War. But in addition to that, everything that Bart says, an illegitimate president would also have no reason, and by the way, Trump would know he was illegitimate, but they would have no reason to respect anything, neither the separation of powers, neither the political independence of the military, which is a long kind of mostly unwritten actually tradition in American politics. Neither the we already saw actually in the first Trump administration, we saw, and hopefully the only Trump administration, we saw, that Trump using the Oval Office, using the White House as a way to make money for himself and for his children and for his company. It looks like a lot of American foreign policy, the more now that we understand about how Trump was running it, was actually designed to help him personally. Either politically or financially. And I can see many more parts of the government turned in that direction. So foreign policy, elements of domestic policy, whatever, tax policy, I can see all of that being turned directly and openly this time towards the support of Trump, his family, his supporters, and that part of the Republican Party that are Trumpists. So we could see a really profound level of corruption in the United States, and I'm afraid it could happen very fast. I mean, it could happen weeks or months within, of a disputed and probably violent inauguration. And so preventing that from happening really should be every citizen's first priority.
Another question from one of our subscribers: why have we not seen the emergence of an anti-corruption movement here the way we have in Europe, in some areas in Europe, for example? And that's probably a good one for you.
Yeah, I wrote about this recently. So the only really effective anti-corruption movement that that's really made a difference in opening up people's eyes is actually in Russia. The main Russian opposition figure, Alexei Navalny, who's now in prison, really built his whole movement, which does include millions of people, on a series of videos and a kind of campaign about revealing the extent of corruption and the extent of kleptocracy in Russia. And he did it very cleverly. He's also quite charismatic, so his personality helped, as well as the subject matter. Why it hasn't emerged in the United States, and particularly in the United Kingdom, which is also one of the, London is one of the world centers for kleptocracy and money laundering as well, is a little puzzling to me. And I suspect it's because so much of the story still feels hidden. The fact is that shell companies, use the laws in places like South Dakota and Nevada and Delaware, as well as the city of London, so the rules and law, the company laws in those places, or in some cases the trust laws in those places, make it possible to hide money or to channel money through banks and other financial institutions in those places, and then to use the money in ways that are either to avoid tax or sometimes as dark money to buy political influence. The stories are often very complicated and hard to understand, sort of for ordinary people. What's a shell company? What are these financial tools that are so complicated? They're hard for journalists to track because they involve sometimes dozens of transactions that take place around the world almost simultaneously. And that's a part of the explanation, but really, just too few American politicians have seized on this as a central piece of the story. They haven't focused on it. They haven't sought to explain it. I mean, there are a few exceptions. There are a few senators. Elizabeth Warren has talked about this. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has talked about this. He's been pretty effective, actually, in trying to get some legislation passed. There are a few others, in the House, but as a fundamental source of distortion, as one of the distorting elements in American public life, nobody has really focused on it or built a campaign around it. And as I said, you can see why that hasn't happened, but really the absence of that, I think, is very important.
Okay, another question from a subscriber, and this is perhaps they're being a bit cheeky, but I'll put this one to you, Bart. The question is, how about secession? We've become two nations. Let's acknowledge it and move on. It won't be easy, but we'll figure out who gets the kids and when and how to split up finances. We can have good relations with each other like the US now has with Canada. So that's the sort of question / proposal. I'd love your reaction to that, Bart.
Well, besides the fact that I'm certainly not in charge, and everyone should be really happy that I'm not in charge of what we should do next. As a citizen, I hate the idea of secession. I'm convinced that we have to make this American experiment work. And by the way, practically speaking, it's a non-starter. We don't have contiguous geographical political boundaries in this country. It's easy to talk about the coasts versus the center and so on. But in fact, an interesting fact about the insurgents of January 6th is that they came primarily from counties in which the vote was close, in which Biden won by a narrow margin, and they were objecting to changes in the world around them. We have cities that are largely Democratic, but we don't have a. In fact, it's not as simple as a big block of states. There would be no way to divide the territory. It would look. It would be worse than the West Bank.
So obviously there's plenty for us as Americans to work on domestically, but there's also the question of our reputation around the world. And another Atlantic subscriber asks, other democratic countries now look at us and laugh. Can America regain its stature within the international community, and how? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
I mean, one of the, some of the greatest damage that has been done by Trump and by the Republicans who've created this big lie conspiracy theory is not only to America's reputation, but to the cause of democracy in other places. Lots of democratic movements around the world, whether it's in Belarus or in Hong Kong, have looked to the United States for inspiration, for help, for support, and now they're afraid more and more often that it's not there. I actually think that I'm more optimistic than most about the possibilities of American Democrats working with Democrats in other places to build some common cause around issues of democracy. And so Biden had his democracy summit in Washington last week. It was really just an online meeting. Not much that was all that concrete came out of it. But it does seem to me that democracies could work together, and this is one of the smaller things that came out of it. They could work together on anti-corruption laws and anti-kleptocracy laws that all of us suffer from. There is a constituency for looking at reform of the internet, that also goes across democracies, and that's something that Biden could do in conjunction with Europeans, with Asian democracies, with democracies around the world. It seems to me that America working on concrete problems with other democracies, and America, and Americans working to support and talk to democracy movements in different places is one of the ways in which we can shore up our own democracy at home, remind ourselves what it's worth. Remember, there are people who are going to jail and being beaten and being murdered just for the right to be able to have a vote in many countries around the world. And it's a good reminder, I think, to us what our democracy is worth. So I would say that it's not so much, the issue isn't really rebuilding our reputation. I mean, our reputation is going to be in trouble as long as we have this anti-democratic movement inside our country. But I do think there's a foreign policy aspect that could actually help at home. As I say, working with other democracies to fix some of the international aspects of the problem, supporting democracy movements, as a way of inspiring them and us. and making it clear that the United States is still, although it's suffering from the same problems that many others are, that it still contains a, plurality, a majority of people who believe in these ideas and these ideals and that are willing to work with others. I think that, I think that's a really important piece of Biden's foreign policy, and I'm hoping they'll get a little bit louder about it.
That's a useful lead into a question we have from Sandra from upstate New York, who writes, I'd like to hear from Ms. Applebaum. How do you put this movement in the context of your December cover story about autocrats dominating the globe? So how do you think about what's happening now and sort of where Trump is looming large in this movement in the context of what's happening globally in terms of autocracy?
So as I say in the article, I think Trump and Trumpists and the Trump campaign learned a lot from autocrats. Trump himself was the beneficiary of the world of kleptocracy over the last 2 decades in his business career. Trump openly sought and then used Russian-style propaganda tactics, and as well as actual Russian bots and trolls in his electoral campaign. And so I think that Trumpism borrowed really from the autocratic world a lot of tactics and ideas and ways of behaving. And so I think, although, one never wants to draw precise lines. I mean, I'm not saying the United States is Russia, or even that, we're in that same category, but I do think that the anti-democratic piece of the Republican Party has learned a lot from its contacts with the autocratic world, and that's a part of the explanation for what we're seeing.
We have so many questions. I'm going to try to get through as many as we can in the next 15 minutes or so. This one comes from Rich Kurth, who asks, do you have any hope that a Republican candidate might win in 2024 other than Trump, he specifies, and that person could transform into a Republican FDR or at least a Republican Eisenhower who would disown Trump? Bart, what do you think?
Well, it's so easy to predict the present, right? I mean, and almost all predictions end up being just a projection of what we see now forward. And so, from my point of view, 2024 is not very far away. Trump is this absolutely dominant figure in the Republican Party, dominant to the point that we have not seen in a politician in a very long time. So that you have very few willing in his party to contest him. And so I made the bold claim in my article that absent a biological intervention, that Trump would be the nominee in 2024. That said, you just never know. I've often wanted to sit down with Liz Cheney and sort of hypnotize her into telling all. And I would like to know, what is her vision of the future of the party? How is it that she is doing what she's doing? Does she have a picture in her mind? Can she imagine a world in which the party comes to her, in which she's not just drummed out, that she makes a big return and develops support for her or for someone like her who want to take a new direction? We won't see that coming until it starts to happen, but I wouldn't rule it out.
We have a lot of questions from folks about the Supreme Court and how you both see the courts playing a role in any sort of continued turmoil with regard to elections. The sort of implication, and in some cases people are explicitly asking this, about sort of the makeup of the court, of course, with Trump's picks and the balance of the court, and also just the recent politicization of it. So I'm curious, sort of, how should we think about what might happen? And Bart, maybe you can take this one first. If we do get to a point where in 2022 or beyond, there's a contested election and the court has to step in, what should citizens be asking or worrying about, frankly?
So here's the piece that I'm not worried about. I don't believe that Trump's appointees are sitting on the court waiting for a chance to make him president come what may. I don't think they feel that obligation to him. I think they have more self-respect than that. They are nevertheless highly conservative and have their own doctrinal preferences. And the concern I have right now is that there's a growing momentum in the legal side of Trump world toward a doctrine that's called independent state legislatures. And this is the doctrine that says that it's up to the state legislatures to decide who their electors are and to decide rules of elections. And Trump's central strategy in his attempt to overthrow the election, no matter all the other things that were going on, his central strategy was to persuade state house and state senate legislators to take control of their state's electors in states that Biden won and send Trump electors to the Electoral College anyway. And there are indications from dicta, from non-binding statements in previous Supreme Court cases that at least 4 justices are interested in and find some persuasiveness in this doctrine of independent state legislature, which comes from the fact that Article 2 of the Constitution states that electors in presidential race will be chosen in such manner as the state legislatures decide. And if you get a 5th justice for that, and you have Republican state houses sending Trump electors when Biden won the popular vote in their states, then we got a potential for pretty earth-shaking trouble.
I want to go back to a question that we talked about a little bit before, and this is where, Bart, you talked about the absence of Republican leadership, but many people who've joined us today are asking about how we get through to the millions of voters who no longer can see the truth or are willfully ignoring it. And Anne, I'm curious for your views on that. Aside from Republican leadership being willing to tell the truth, what else can be done to get through to people who are operating in a different reality right now?
So I've actually, in the last few weeks, have been asking this question of some European politicians as well. I talked to the leader of the Hungarian opposition, who has exactly the same problem, and even worse in some ways, because something like 95% of the media in Hungary is controlled by the ruling party. And so that gives him 5%, in order to try and reach the whole country. I've talked to the de facto leader of the Polish opposition. I've talked to the leader of the center right in Spain, and about all these. And none of them have kind of slam dunk answers. I mean, the best they can say is, most of them talk about choosing themes that will unify people. So, in other words, trying to rekindle feelings of patriotism as opposed to nationalism, or using patriotic and universal themes that can reach people, and so not falling into the polarization trap. Some of them speak about focusing on issues of corruption. As I was saying, there's a anti-corruption campaign in Hungary that is trying to take off. The astute use of social media to try and reach people inside their filter bubbles. That there's a whole technical conversation around that. That's actually pretty difficult to do. Liz Cheney, whom I have spoken to in the past, has talked about trying to reach voters at a very grassroots level. When she's at home in Wyoming, she goes around from, town hall to town hall and makes her arguments, very often against very hostile audiences. And so the more people who are able to do that, the better. I would also say that there's a role for non-political authority figures, whether it's religious leaders or business leaders or other kinds of community leaders who have some trust inside kind of, Republican majority communities, if they were able to speak to the people who work for them or work with them, or the people who go to their churches. And I'm aware of some attempts to do that as well. That is also can be very difficult. I mean, there have been a couple of Atlantic writers, Peter Weiner and David French, who've both written about this increasingly bizarre phenomenon of evangelical congregations pushing back against against their leaders, against preachers who try and even to depoliticize the conversation. So that's difficult. But it seems to me there's a sort of dozen different small answers that have to be part of the question. And actually, Bart alluded to this before. Biden's answer, which has been, make democracy work, talk about things that are real, talk about, housing and roads and schools instead of talking about mythical culture wars. Although it hasn't been successful in the United States, I mean, if you look at post-conflict countries, I mean, if you look at Northern Ireland, for example, very often when you have had a very bad conflict, one of the solutions is to try to get people to return to talking about, again, real things as opposed to the things that divide them and their sort of irreconcilable differences. The more that, and this is something the Democratic Party could do, the more that the Democratic Party and Democratic leadership can change the subject so that we're talking about things that we can disagree about, but in a civilized way. As I said, should we build a road or a bridge? The better off we will be if we can just have a single conversation again. And then the final, a final part of the answer, but this is too long term to help us immediately, is the thing that Adrienne, you and I have both written about, which is reform of the internet and the way that it works. But that's a longer term conversation.
Well, and do you think that post-conflict is the right framework or the necessary framework for us, rather than, should we be thinking about America in post-conflict terms versus trying to avert conflict at this stage, or where are we?
No, so it's really the same process. It's what do you do when you have two very polarized communities, and it can either be after a civil war, or in the case of Northern Ireland, it can be which that was in effect an ongoing. It wasn't a civil war; it was a kind of ongoing conflict that is surprisingly similar to what we have. You have two communities who have completely different definitions of what they think their nation is. They call themselves by different names. They have different values. Each one thinks the other are traitors. How do you somehow bring them together again so that they can live in the same state? So that was the problem in Northern Ireland, and the sort of conflict resolution measures, not really post-conflict actually, but conflict resolution measures involved getting people together at the community level and getting them to talk about other things. It's very hard in the United States. And in fact, I know some experiments like that have actually failed. I mean, there have been towns where mayors have tried to bring people together and not succeeded. On the other hand, there are some success stories as well. There are a number of community organizations and sort of NGOs who have tried to facilitate those kinds of conversations across the United States, and some of them have had some success. Better Angels is probably the most famous one, but there are a number of others. And by the way, that's another thing you can join in your community. You can look for it or create it.
Well, thank you both so much. That is all the time we have for. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's here with us. You can read more of Bart's work and Anne's work on theatlantic.com, or pick up our latest issue, which is on newsstands this week. And if you enjoyed this conversation and want more of The Atlantic, you can support our journalism by becoming a subscriber. We hope you will do that. Thank you again, both. And thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.